On this week's podcast, I met with Richard Kirk, founder of Kirk Studio. Kirk Studio is a Brisbane-based firm that offers architecture and urban design to clients within Brisbane and the wider Australia, as well as overseas. Kirk often works with innovative materials, as well as takes on projects that offer a sustainable impact to their clients. I hope you enjoy this podcast, and if you do, please consider liking and subscribing to do your part to grow the podcast. Thank you. We're industrial designers, but it's really interesting to learn more about different disciplines and today architecture. So thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So maybe just to start off, if you just wanted to talk a bit to your background as an architect and maybe discuss the specific projects that led you up to where you are today in your career.
Okay, thank you. I've been an architect for probably close to 25 or 27 years. Basically started the practice within about 2 years of leaving university. And actually in the background of two of our projects, you can see a little bit of one on the top right-hand side and a more recent one just behind me. So the practice started out doing what most architects do, which is domestic architecture, quite small projects. But very early on, we always wanted to make sure that the practice could do any scale of work. So we always thought about, even though they were small projects, we always imagined and approached them in a way that, in a strategic way, so that we could always change scale into the larger, more complex projects. So we basically honed our skills on those much smaller, more in some cases more challenging projects, so that when we sort of moved into that next scale of size and complexity, we had the design process was ready. So over the last 25 years, we moved from fairly quickly through single houses through to larger scale housing projects, urban design projects. We started to focus on a lot of university work, so education projects became a real interest to us, because in our minds they were sort of the projects that provided that opportunity to think about the building, but also the building in its context, more of an urban project, but also the buildings themselves were quite unique. They often had really interesting functions and also had clients that were very ambitious about them, wanting to set new benchmarks for sustainability or develop new pedagogies in the way that the students would be taught in them. Yes, so now we work not just in Australia, we're a Brisbane-based practice, but we work in Southeast Asia as well. So we sort of started to work internationally maybe about 15 years ago, and we sort of saw there was a natural affinity for architects like us working in Brisbane to actually work in the region, the more tropical region, so that we could sort of share the skills and the sort of design approach we have working locally with the subtropics and tropics, because they're quite demanding conditions, basically.
That's interesting. So you're saying the specific conditions of these countries relate closely to the conditions in Australia, and that kind of brings Australian architects a bit of a benefit? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the importance of, yes, like Brisbane's a subtropical climate, so that means it's yes, we have a summer and we have distinct seasons, but we also it has a colder period.
Yep.
But certainly designing for our summers, you need to sort of sets you up well for working within the tropical region, which is one of the it's one of the sort of dominant climatic zones in the world, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, maybe from there, like obviously you've worked in Brisbane for many years, and even in my lifetime, I've noticed like Brisbane has changed so much architecturally. What major changes have you noticed in your lifetime in Brisbane, and like what kind of changes do you think in the future are going to really change the architectural landscape?
that's an important question. I think there's a few things we still haven't got right. I don't think the city thinks about the kind of public space particularly well, which is why we don't have any large-scale public spaces in the city. We're sort of, I think the city needs to develop more of those. But certainly the Australian cities are known for being very dense. That means the number of people living in a particular area is very high. Our densities are very high. So Brisbane's probably gone from one of the least dense cities in Australia to having pockets of some of the greatest density. And that's partly due to the fact that our inner city is quite constrained. And if you think of the city as having this meandering river, it creates these peninsulas. So the peninsulas get quite constrained quite quickly, unlike, say, Melbourne, which is a continuous grid of a city that can grow relatively easily. But the sort of inner frame, or the inner part of Brisbane City, has a lot of natural constraints. So I think so. The biggest change is really the arrival of in my lifetime of high density towers for apartment living, the replacement of a lot of inner city industrial activities. You can see there's a few remnant industries in West End and South Brisbane. I mean, that's they're the leftovers of what once was an industrial hub for the city. So you can sort of see that in the history of the city, that all of those functional parts of the city have been pushed further and further out. So I think that will continue, of course, but the only other change I think is I think there's sort of starting to be a reduced reliance on the car. I think people are taking up alternative forms of transport, and riding's a big one. And I think the recent change to the lower cost transport fares to 50 cents a trip, I think, has been fantastic, and will hopefully encourage that greater use of public transport.
Yeah, I'm interested more about the You got Ethan, sorry.
No, I was just agreeing
Cool.
with the transport, absolutely.
I'm interested more about the what you're specifically saying about how the city is obviously limited by the river. What kind of ways do you think architecturally we could improve that limitation in the future?
Well, it was not that long ago that the idea of pedestrian bridges wasn't even thought of as important. I think that the ability to plan Brisbane to kind of treat the river like an asset rather than like a constraint, so that certainly using the river edge and using the bridges to sort of shorten distances and to make the opposite sides of the river sort of basically become neighbourhoods. We actually did a paper or a report, must be 15 years ago or 18 years ago, where we were actually commissioned to do a study on what they call the river edge. And we said, oh, that's interesting, but it'll just be all about how it looks, not how it works. And really, we should change the report into being about how we can cross the river and start to make the city, what is quite a compact city, more compact and more accessible. So to give you an idea of scale, if you lay Central Park on Brisbane, it goes from the city centre past the University of Queensland.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, so
crazy.
Very small city, and I think we have to be, I think the planners and the architects and the developers, they need to be very creative about how this quite small, very what we call fine-grained city the lots that you're dealing with are very small. How do we build density, and how do you build, livable density in our city?
Yeah.
A project I was interested in with your career was the Gabba West project that I believe was a proposal. Is that correct? Could you tell me a bit
Yes,
more about
very,
that?
yes, it's a very speculative proposal. So we did that ourselves. We felt that the office felt that the conversation around the Olympics had become a bit like an auction around of what site options there were, and it sort of neglected to understand that to fit a stadium for 60,000 seats into a city like Brisbane, you're not going to find a site that will have all the attributes that you need. You're going to have to create the site, and you're going to have to find the best place for it, but also work out what you need to do to accommodate that large structure.
Yeah.
And so it was really about, we did it as a part of a submission to the 100-day review that was underway, and we issued it to the media because we wanted the media to start to hopefully take on a more nuanced view or a nuanced approach to how to think about the Olympics and what it means for the city. And we also, I suppose the big message in our proposal was to say that you really want to put something like a stadium or any major new piece of infrastructure, you want to make sure that it repairs something that's actually incomplete or broken. You don't want to go and, if a city keeps putting its new buildings into open space, it'll run out of open space.
Yep.
And it's just a very overly simplistic way to planning a city. So, these large infrastructure projects, whether it be an Olympic stadium or an arena or anything else, is really about how do you repair the city, because Brisbane's only it's a very young city since it was settled. It really hasn't had a lot of urban renewal to the level that other cities around the world have.
Yeah.
And and when we were, as I mentioned before about the bridge study that we did, we actually listed all of the cities that were river cities and how many bridges they had. And there were most cities had hundreds or 1,000 bridges, whereas Brisbane had like 6. So for us, it was just sort of started, when you start to sort of see how we compare, it gets, that sort of way to reflect on how we've evolved as a city or how we've developed, becomes a really useful way to sort of hopefully speculate what we need to focus on. And the real idea behind Gabba West was we actually gave it a name, first of all, that the site actually has some presence. And then to us, it made a lot of sense that if you add a bit of land, like you do a resumption, which the government's entitled to do, you actually get the perfect north-south orientation for the stadium. You get to use the existing Cross River Rail station, which currently, if the Gabba isn't used, will sort of be a complete waste of infrastructure. And the real beauty of the site is that it's already a building site. It's it's ready to go. And the other aspect is there's a cultural dimension to a city. This is where the city's always had its main stadium. So you keep that continuity of the way that part of the city is used, consistent.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I was thinking more about the idea of like what makes a efficiently built city, and that's something that I've always been really interested in, like specifically when I went to Adelaide. I thought it was an amazing city, how it was constructed. Like it was, you're familiar with how Adelaide is. It's like a grid city. I think there's a few cities like this. I think Christchurch is another one, which is by the
Yep.
same designer,
Yes, that's right.
as far as I know. And really interesting actually the way the city's built, like with the inner city, and then you have like kind of a garden area around the city that you can go to like escape the city. And like the idea of like thinking how to create a city when creating the city, whereas Brisbane, where they've just kind of like slowly expanded over like time when more and more people came, putting roads and buildings down wherever they can, kind of thing. But unfortunately, the reality is, I suppose, like, you look at all these like famous cities in history, like, London, like for example, it looks crazy when you look at it on a map because it wasn't planned, and Brisbane's kind of ended up like that as well. And I suppose then you have to work with the constraints you have and make the city as good as you can after the fact. Yeah. Yep.
No, you're right. There's some cities are well planned. That doesn't mean they're always successful. But for example, Barcelona is a classic where the growth of the city was managed and planned. So you've got that great comparison of effectively the original or the medieval center of the city surrounded by a modern planning grid. And that shows you in a very diagrammatic way the different ways cities evolved, but they're both interesting. But a lot of the European cities have those sort of medieval cores, which are organic. And it wasn't really, the roads weren't straight. People literally, they just simply evolved. And the movement patterns defined the way the grid worked. And you see it in cities like New York as well. You'll have the original, I think 16th century city grid, and then into the 19th century grid that we all know, which Central Park's a part of. So I think it's there's a famous book or thesis about cities called about collage cities. This idea that cities can be a range of things. They don't have to be one idea. They can be a range of planning patterns, whether it be gridded or organic or boulevarded, with a very hierarchical structure like Canberra and Washington, where there's a sort of an idea about how the city's organised. I spend a bit of time in Asia, and one of the things I enjoy is looking at the way cities like, for example, Saigon, which is actually a French planned city, it has become Asianized and taken over by the people that live there, and the way that some of those, to your point about efficiency, the planning ideas about how movement happens in a city. The French had a very sophisticated idea about the car and the way you could make that movement free flowing and elegant. The use of very exotic roundabouts in Saigon and the way traffic can flow without being interrupted is a really fantastic skill set. But then getting the other parts of the city that are suited for people movement. And I think that's the thing about efficiency. It's about having a range of different ways to conceive of how you want to move through the city in different ways, in different areas, so that you still sort of create those walkable village-like scales, as well as the ability to move at greater speed, because time's important.
Yep.
But they both can be done in an interesting way, like the French planners did in Saigon, which is probably one of my favorite cities in Asia.
Yeah, I feel like when I think back to London, like I used to live in London when I was younger, and it's complete chaos the way the city's built, but there's something really nice to it. Like you can have a grid city that's super organized, but it won't feel as natural as something that's just so organic. Like buildings are weird shapes because that's the kind of real estate they have, or there's little like garden. What's great in London, I found, is the little garden courtyards and things like that, and so many public parks. Like, so you can be walking from one location to the next, and you'll go through industrial area, and you'll end up in like a nice green park just because of the way the city's built out. It feels more natural when it's that organic and like not necessarily as planned. It has a nice feeling to it. I suppose that is lost to some degree. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. The organic cities, well, those parts of the cities that are sort of evolved are always more interesting, especially because that's usually the pedestrianised parts of the city as well. So I think, London's a great example. The inner core of Barcelona is another example. I think all of those, even Budapest, which is very much a Renaissance or actually post-Renaissance city for the most part, still has a medieval core as well. It's just and which they typically do then pedestrianize. So that tends to be why they're always more interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's inevitably they're always more engaging because you've always got something to see. And one of the things that I think to your earlier point about the city, Brisbane as a city, when you go around Europe, some of the jurisdictions are so sophisticated. So, for example, in Budapest, if you have a building that's in a prominent corner or a prominent location, and the city wants you to redevelop or improve the facade because it's about the experience of the city, they actually provide funding for that. So, whereas, this is the other, hallmark of Western cities, or, let's call them Australian cities, is that they're largely developed privately. You have a few public projects, but generally it's private development that actually creates the cities that we live in. Whereas I quite like the Hungarian idea of this, that the city is really for everyone, and that the quality of the cityscape is really important and that should be invested in. And I think some of those ideas, that sort of sensitivity around how you kind of co-develop a city with the private land owners is an interesting one.
Yeah, okay. Should I go, Ethan?
Yeah. Again, on the kind of organic style guide of cities and things. Obviously, organic has gained a fair bit of attention within years. Organic forms and shapes and facades again. Can you kind of delve into that a bit more in terms of making it work within each city, like within Brisbane and things, or other cities abroad?
Yeah, you're right. So in some projects, you see that the architects will do a completely organic form, like people like Frank Gehry, the Canadian architect, who actually did a project for UTS in Sydney where it was this sort of organic brick facade. That's probably the most well-known one locally. So that's sort of something that's possible because of digital technology. It's made it that sort of idea of manufacturing from a file, a digital file that you can now do on a larger scale. Mind you, people like Gaudi in Barcelona didn't do that. That was all done by skilled masons producing his work. So you don't need to do it. You don't need a digital design system to do it, but it obviously it makes it more accessible. So so that's it's probably it's all about efficiency of how you deliver the buildings. How do you make the enclosure and it does rely on fairly sophisticated materials to do it well. I have seen some organic buildings using conventional materials, which doesn't work very well. So the enclosure or the facade system needs to be designed, and probably one of the most elegant examples of that is the Sydney Opera House, where it's an organic shape. It's a geometry, so it could be replicated, and the skin, which is ceramic tiles, can be designed to suit the shape, and that's why it's such an enduring building. But you're right, the possibilities are now endless with digital fabrication. It just comes down to what will work and what won't work for people's budgets and the function of the building.
Yeah. And how does that tie in with like engineering and I guess like legalities within council spaces and government spaces and things as well?
Well, certainly doing a building that hasn't used materials and construction systems the same way before, as in what we call like a prototype of materials and structure. I mean, the Opera House was a prototype. It had never been done before, and I don't think it's ever been replicated again either. And so that's clearly a liability that the designers and the builders take on. So I think that's an interesting point. There's a level of risk in doing something that's new, particularly in construction, because construction, it's obviously expensive, and you have one chance to do that building, and to rectify a building is usually very, very complicated. So what we in our industry we call it, their clients are typically risk averse because they don't want to, they want to push the boundaries and they want to do new things, but they want to typically do that in a way that doesn't is lower risk than what you might do if you were prototyping for a one-off industrial item, for example, which is why you do prototype and test. So imagine if you had to prototype with the building, which is a big endeavor, and you don't get the second chance to fix up the errors that you might have found in the first way through. So buildings tend to use, like the image behind me, it's using a lot of traditional materials like timber and copper, but it's done within a geometry, which is basically a vault that we trimmed and cut. But we clad it in a very, very old material that you see on all the domes, and it's basically copper cladding, but done in a shingle shape. Again, very, very old detail, but applied to a new structure. So it's a combination of old traditional technology and detailing sensibility and how you might apply it in a new way, is the way that we deal with that issue of risk and trying to do something new and different, but actually doesn't expose our clients to any sort of risk. But having said that particular project was quite a lot of complexity in developing that.
We hope you're enjoying this week's podcast on Let's Talk Design. And if you are, please consider liking and subscribing, as it really helps us out to grow the podcast. Thank you.
So it was simpler to do that than try and calculate that using all the digital tools that we have.
Yeah, I'm interested more about the sorry, I always forget his name, from Barcelona, who designed the famous Gothic building. What was his name?
Gaudi.
Gaudi, that's right. So there's obviously such a divide between like Gaudi's maximalist Gothic architecture and then what we have today, which is like, sort of Bauhaus inspired, like minimalist architecture and with a lot of use of glass and things like that, and a lot of architecture. Obviously there's two different complete divides there. Like, do you think we are going to see a bring back to the history of architecture more in the future, like kind of inspiring from some of those more like classic buildings that are made in such an amazing way? Or do you think we will continue on this kind of path towards like more minimalistic architecture?
Well, I think for most of us, it'll be building is really has a primary function to house people. So I think for most buildings that people experience will be what you might call modernist and functional. But there's no reason why they're not elegant and refined and humanized. That they're beautiful spaces to be in. There's absolutely many examples of that. But the sort of, it's hard to, when you look at a building like Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, it's like a multi-generational project. It's by the time I think it's now officially finished.
It was only just finished recently, which is insane. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's not unusual for cathedrals of that scale throughout many cities. So the idea that you would take 3 or 4, even 5 generations to build your main cathedral was sort of typical. So they're very different exercises and scale of projects, and they have very different purposes. And the fact that these buildings are still these cathedrals are still the heart of many of these cities just shows you the power of building those iconic structures within a city. And originally they were really about about many things, but they're also about the legibility of the city. They became a point of reference. And you remember that, cities before people had maps and cities before people had iPhones, of course, that idea of being tall and dominant and visible had what wasn't gratuitous. It was actually very functional. Had lots of reasons for that, and that was sort of the cathedral was the convergence of the law as well. That was the legal epicenter of most of the communities that they served. But yeah, but I think for most of us, I think the idea is that buildings serve a purpose and they need to do that in an efficient way. A lot of the work we do is to try and deliver buildings that can be done very efficiently, built quickly, built to a high level of precision. That's why we use a lot of timber, because it's fully prefabricated. Like the structure behind me, it's fully prefabricated. There's no cutting or anything, not even any drilling. It's actually all ready to be installed on site. Wow. And they can be erected very quickly. So, and I think the where I think it's the answer is that it's, you can do a very elegant, low cost but efficient structure that still has that sense of grandeur. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be complicated. The Sagrada Familia is sort of one of those wonders of the world, So that's just inevitable. That there will always be those standout projects that define a particular, one of the highest orders of craft and arts and craft in the world, basically.
Absolutely. When you're working with engineers, how do you manage the balance between aesthetic architectural choices and practical engineering requirements?
Well, the one thing you can't escape from is structure. So we try to integrate it and we try to work collaboratively very early. Like, again, the structure behind me, we start with the engineering solution. We wanted the architecture to be very thin, so or the shell of the form to be very thin. So we have to work closely with how we can achieve that, and we study options and we test different approaches. We might have tried different sort of framing ideas for that. but yeah, it's early integration. We have these workshops where we simply sketch and talk about ideas, and they might take away several options to explore, and then we come back and have another workshop which refines that even further. It's an interactive process. One of the things that architects have to do is work with not just structural engineers, but all the services. Even that structure you see there, we wanted to design the acoustics in a particular way so that when the players were in that space, that they could hear one another, so that they get that feedback that musicians want. So we had an acoustic engineer work with us to do that, and they tested that what we call in a parametric way. So they ran it through some software called Grasshopper, which tells them how the energy reflects. And what we were trying to do is avoid the energy or the sound energy occurring in one area, so that some people didn't hear it, which means some people would hear nothing and someone would hear too much. So that's why we exposed the structure, and that's why we had a soffit detail, which is the underside of the roof, shaped in a particular way. So yeah, it's very collaborative, and it's more efficient that way. And sometimes we're not clear in our own minds where we're trying to take things, but we're just looking for opportunities that the structure can give us. So that, and we always try to make sure that our buildings, that everything has a purpose. And if it has more than one purpose, that's even better. So yes, the timber structure you see is visually interesting, but it's what holds up the building. But it also helps the acoustics. And the reason why it's timber is that we wanted this structure to be sustainable, in the sense that it's renewable. Timber is the only renewable building material you can use. So it was really about having an educational or a learning function, as well as a function about shelter and events, like a performance space that structure is.
It's really interesting, actually, how it all ties in, all parties tie in together, and actually creates that as an end goal. That's what we're taught through design, right? As we both study the same degree of industrial design, and that's kind of like the concept that you always taught, but you never really see it until you speak to people like yourself. And even that's a different discipline, it's architecture, but it's all kind of transferable skills, isn't it?
And I think because I started the practice early, I benefited enormously by working closely with consultants, because they're quite expert in a particular field. Architects have a skill set that's separate to that, but you need to rely on all of their skill sets. So the more I just found naturally that it was more productive and more rewarding to work closely with them as a team.
Yeah.
And it gave you something that was a little bit. I like the design process to be a little bit unpredictable. You got to be. You learn to be a bit more relaxed. You don't want to sort of try to preempt where something should go, or you don't want to force it. And I'm sure it's like that in industrial design. And you want to let the process take you in a particular direction, and that's where you get something that's genuinely interesting. And some of our clients, actually a lot of our clients, like the idea that they've got something that's unique and it's a bit of a one-off. It's not about just choosing standard products and trying to compose them. It's actually about giving them something that uses conventional materials, but in a unique way and an exotic way.
Yep.
But whilst at the same time using conventional skills that people with the the tools on site have to make, and we've always, I mean, to your point about the Bauhaus idea of the functional building, one of the things we've always found as a way of dealing with avoiding the functionality or the very overly functional buildings becoming a bit bland or a bit soulless was we always harness that idea of craft, that even though a lot of buildings, we think of our time as very reliant on technology, a lot of construction is still assembled by people putting a material and a product in place by hand.
Yep.
And and when we say handmade, we're not meaning like a piece of pottery that you can see the thumbprints on, but it's actually recognizing that someone has to physically put these elements in and screw them off and fix them off. And that by sort of revealing what that looks like, that's our way of respecting that skill set of those people who have to make these buildings.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. We experience that in our job as well. We work in like a manufacturing company, and obviously there's always like, I remember when I graduated university. Well, wait, maybe not graduated, but when I first went into university to learn about product design, I had that in my mind that everything in the world is just automated now, and like people don't do much in manufacturing anymore, and like any piece of metal would be CNC machined or something like that. But the reality is, like, manual labor, like hardworking welders, fabricators, like things like that, woodworkers, like it's still very manual, and there's like still such a craft to tree manufacturing that it hasn't died out till this day. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's I was walking through a facade factory in China, which was producing this new facade for a very big building, and the facade was all based on this idea that it was this one glazing unit, but set out in different ways. In a series of steps, but it was the one module. But each step was different. And you can imagine this on a facade with maybe, there would have been 20,000 of these pieces in this building. It was a huge tower. And every one of them was being measured and cut by hand. But the image of the building is that it's this sort of robotically made facade, but it wasn't. It was it's cheaper to do it by hand as a series of one-offs than it is to try and develop a system, because it's such a unique idea. No one will want to do this again. So it's this. I think that's the next dimension to what you're talking about, whether it's the Gaudi or the Bauhaus modernism, or Bauhaus minimalism or functionalism. This is this other idea that buildings appear as though the facade is made very efficiently, and it's just through tweaking a couple of dimensions that it looks more interesting, is actually a very complicated thing to do, and it's purely done for visual purposes, and which is fine. Tall buildings need to be visual because they're very dominant. But it's that idea that it's a sort of a faux efficiency. It's actually very complicated and does rely on. And I've got a fantastic photo of this guy who was hand measuring every one of these cuts for a massive project.
Oh well.
I'm curious as to we both use 3D printing as a source of prototyping. I've seen when students are studying architecture at uni that they're using models with lollipop sticks and things. Is that like a continued practice throughout, or is it more digital? And
well, hopefully they're not using the lollipop sticks, but yeah, I think we look, certainly doing both is important. So you're in a way, a model is a prototype. So, and sometimes when we make a model out of card or balsa or anything really, because you have to make it in a certain way, usually making it quickly, sometimes it gives you clues as to what the form could be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the idea of using basic materials and making something quickly gives you a different sense of perception of the scale of it and the form, because just a computer gives you a different reading of what a building might be like.
Yeah.
And no matter how good the sort of real-time rendering that we now have, and those sort of quick prototyping in the actual computer modeling that you can do as well, or the digital prototyping, the physical model making is still really valuable. And then when you augment that with the 3D printing, which happens more and more, you get another sort of understanding or perception of what the form is that you're trying to make. So I think we would always generate a physical model and try and do it very early. And often we come back to that physical model. Sometimes we'll make a very rough one out of balsa and we'll do it ourselves. Other times we'll go and get, when we think the project's close, we'll then go and make it out of solid timber as a way of like marking a point in time, so that we think these are the important elements of it. And we want to keep that. And we go back and we make sure that we're making it better, not worse. So you sort of keep that sort of initial sort of kind of idea about the form. You want to keep that live. You don't want to dilute that as you develop the building, and sometimes that can happen. But the 3D printer, you know, the biggest challenge with that is making sure they always work. It is great too for larger scale, like we use it for a lot when we do a master plan, where you just want to sort of see what that sort of precinct plan might look like, and you can generate that quickly. But yeah, I think you still use all sorts of ways to visualize the building, and to review it and reflect on it, and there's a real value in it being quick and it being rough and not refined. And then at some later stage, you do want to do that refined model just as a way of validating, because as you make it, you start to see models are fantastic in the sense that you see the form in many different ways. Whereas no matter how hard you try, the 3D rendering is always a bit, it's always gives you a certain type of understanding that's sometimes you can't just rely on that alone.
Yeah. Do you think we'll be 3D printing buildings in the coming years? Like, I know we're talking about traditional manufacturing methods. What kind of methods do you think are going to become more prominent in the future? Will there be new methods, or do you think we'll kind of stick with these traditional ones?
It's a good question. Look, I think for as long as I've been an architect, there's always been this pushing, this sort of frustrated pushing pushing the boundaries on how to build more efficiently. And look, you know, conventional building is efficient because it's got a large workforce, and because building's cyclical, it means that you don't have a big factory sitting there not doing anything. So I think that you've asked a few questions there. Well, firstly, 3D printing a building, as it's sort of, people are doing that. Not sure how viable it is, but some of it's quite interesting. But they tend to put a lot of energy in making what's the simplest thing to do, which is a wall, right? So the most complex part of buildings are enclosing them and finishing all the finishing trades. The structure doesn't tend to be the most expensive part of the building. In fact, you know, in some of the bigger projects we do, the actual structural cost is not the dominant cost. It's a large part of it, but it's not the dominant cost. So I think 3D printing will have place, but I'm only guessing. It to me will rely on a particular type of medium to do that. As you know, it's quite complicated to have a single product that does everything from structure to insulate to be weatherproof and all those sort of things. So it's really the rest of the system, like how do you deal with glazing and how does the roof work and all those things. But certainly more modularized construction, more sophisticated building systems. Like you already see now that in some of the low-cost housing, all of the framing's already assembled. It comes as pre-made frames, and they just simply stand them up. That's a super efficient way. So you can build a single-story house in a few months, basically, maybe 4 months. So it's really hard to compete with that efficiency, I think. Using anything more sophisticated than current technology. I think there's a lot of work going in modular and pre-constructed homes, the volumetric home that's already made and you've got to ship it somewhere, or the flat pack idea that you're sort of bringing a building system that you then assemble. I actually think the flat pack one will be probably the most successful one, but it's really the cladding, it's the enclosing, and it's all the finishing trades that tend to drive the time and the cost. A lot of effort's always put on structure, but it's actually the finishing trades that and all the different site configurations are the biggest issues. And I think Australia also missed out, unfortunately, where we use land so inefficiently. That's the big part of what you're talking about, is how we use land. We sort of have only now started to build smaller houses on smaller lots, and row houses. Row houses are a really efficient way to house people. That's where a lot of effort should go to refine that. But I'm not sure that 3D printing will be a widespread solution for building. But certainly robotic. When we use timber, there's a lot of screws and fixings that need to happen. I've seen one project experiment with a robot to do the screw fixing on the floor. That was pretty cool. So I think a bit of that'll sort of start to come in. I think that sort of support, if I could describe it as a sort of a ancillary support sort of technology or digital technology, might come to the building sites, rather than sort of a robot doing everything sort of thing. But that's just speculating.
Maybe to talk more about, like, specifically thinking about the challenges when designing buildings. What specific challenges do you go through designing something that stands out but also meets functional needs, price point needs, all these other needs, but while also still creating something innovative? Like, obviously you've created some pretty, amazing looking buildings in the past and different architectural things, but how do you balance that with the other requirements?
You've just that's my job description, basically. Look, it's difficult. Probably one of the big roles of an architect is to understand what the client needs, not just functionally, because that's quite a specific task, but also how to balance exactly what you've said. How much investment do they make in that project? What are their real goals, and what do they have to invest in? What degree of investment, or how much money, basically. And then the other aspect is trying to understand that buildings don't maintain themselves. They've got to be looked after. They've got to be well made in the first place. And they also need to be designed in a way that they endure. So you don't want to do, it's not like, a building's not like a piece of clothing that can be interesting and fashionable for a few months or a year, or I don't know, a couple of years. A building's got to sort of look sensible and for its life. You know, a building has to have that integrity, for that design integrity for a long time. So I think that's the one way of answering your question. It's a balancing act of yes, meeting their ambitions, you know, and some of our clients will have great ambitions for their projects. You know, where you know, one of that, we've had a brief where someone says we want a new benchmark for sustainability. So we want people to use our building as the reference for what a sustainable building is. That's a very, you know, that was an old brief, but that's a very big challenge. Other clients will say, they'll actually say, we don't want our building to be a new benchmark for sustainability. We just want to sort of make sure that we do a few, you know, as many of the right things or the sustainable measures as possible, but we don't want to do everything. So people have different levels of ambition. And it doesn't matter that we think they should have more ambition. It's really about trying to guide them through that process of where do they want to sit. It's like, you know, our clients walk into you know, to think of buying a car that's not there, and they have to describe what sort of car do they want. You know, is it a Fiat, you know, Bambino, or is it a, you know, a much more elaborate car than that? So it's about having that dialogue with them to understand where their sensitivities are, and sometimes they're very clear, other times they're not, and that's what makes the design process so challenging. But it's also, you know, some architects are very good at taking clients on that journey of helping them articulate what it is they are trying to achieve with the project, because it's got to do many things, right? It's got to meet all of their current needs. It's got to meet some of their future needs that we aren't fully aware of. So we're trying to build in flexibility. And we do that in a number of ways so that we know that they're going to change the way they use the building. I mean, just look at the way office spaces have been challenged with the recent pandemic. You know, they have to work in a very different way now that they did in the past. So you want to make sure buildings can accommodate those futures that aren't obvious to us right now. And the way technology changes the way people use buildings. And the expectation around, then the other big issue is really their expectation around durability and what we call the design life of a building. So, and we have climate change. So, you know, a good architect will be thinking about, well, things are going to be hotter. We're going to need to put more insulation in. We're going to make sure the roof needs to perform more because we want this building to be capable of withstanding a different type of climate. And you'll see that also in places where cyclones increase. So we just did a building where we convinced the client that it's important to make the building, I wouldn't call it cyclone proof, but we call it debris impact proof. It's the only building in the north of Queensland that has that attribute. So you would say that's a new standard of building for the cyclonic region of Australia. Now, that's a challenging thing to do because it hadn't been done before. There are a lot of products. In fact, there were no products that we could buy off the shelf. We had to test everything to make sure it did meet that standard. But up until then, most clients, when they built their building, would allow it, if a cyclone came through, to be damaged, and then they would repair it after. So it's interesting, and because with climate change, the expectation is northern Queensland will have more cyclones, not less. So we were particularly keen and this was an engineering building, so this building taught young engineers. We wanted to make sure the building had attributes around it that the engineers could study and understand. How do you achieve these things? And so we were always interested in buildings that actually, that's why we like working in the education sector, that the building themselves actually have a learning dimension or a learning element to them, that they actually leave behind some knowledge that can be studied. And we've done that in a lot of different ways. Like we'll put strain gauges onto reinforcement before we pour the concrete, and then you can go and measure that once the building's finished, what sort of forces are going through that structure. You know, this idea that buildings buildings have always got to do a lot more than just provide like a house or a form of accommodation.
I guess lastly, what advice would you give to emerging architects that are just starting their careers off today?
Question. I think architects are generalists, and you know, it's important to remember your core skills, which is really around being great listeners, and also you can learn a lot from the clients. You know, some of our clients that we've worked with have been not just inspirational, but incredibly clever about what it is they are trying to achieve with their projects. So, you know, some of the, you know, that idea of navigating how to define a project brief is a really important skill, and you'll learn a lot from your clients. And then the other is really just, you have to, there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot to continue. There's a lot of continuing sort of exploration and learning through the process of designing. As you know, in industrial design, things are always changing. And in some ways, there's a lot of parallels with what you do in the sense that, you know, you've got the end user and you've got systems where, you know, different ways of making things, and you have changing tastes, you know. So I think it is really the being a great listener and being prepared to learn from the people you work with throughout your career, I think is the greatest opportunity if you're starting out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Richard. It's been really interesting to have you on to learn a bit more about architecture and, you know, specifically from Brisbane context. We both, well, Ethan grew up on the Sunshine Coast, but I actually grew up in Brisbane and in the South Side. And it's interesting to, hear an architect who specifically works in Brisbane chat about their career. And thank you so much for coming on.
Okay, thanks very much, and pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Talk again soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.